Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, we are really leaning into the Spanish lit part of that PhD. We're going to take a good look today at Arráncame la vida by Angeles Mastretta. Vamos a meternos pero profundamente en este librazo que a mí me encanta. We are not going to speak very much in Spanish, although I did realize when I was preparing the lecture that, of course, my copy of the book is in Spanish, which means that as we are looking at some of these different passages, I'll either be paraphrasing or I'll be doing a little bit of on-the-fly translation, which is always kind of an interesting experience. So we always begin with this question of why read this book. I love this book. It was published in 1985. I thought I read it right when it came out, but that is not possible because I was in high school and I was actually studying French at the time. So I must have studied it later in college or maybe even in graduate school. It is a book that I have loved from the start, and it is a book that I return to occasionally. And with all amazing books, every time I return to it, there is something totally different that it has to offer. A lot of what is appealing about the book remains the same. There's a lightness in the tone. Our main protagonist, Catalina Guzman, is so appealing in so many ways. The description of the Mexican Revolution and the immediate period following the revolution is so rich and so interesting, but told from this kind of familial, domestic space that makes it really accessible. Although, of course, it is super confusing because the Mexican Revolution and the post-revolutionary period are, in fact, super confusing. And that is not something that Mastretta is shying away from. But in many ways, the romantic in me really leans into the idea of this as a love story. And one of the questions I had when I was going back to it today is this sense of how is it that Mastretta is giving us this very strong protagonist in Catalina Guzman, but also allowing her to be so appealing when in fact she's deeply in love, at least for a very long time, with this general who she meets when she is 15 years old, and he's 20 years older than she is, and they end up marrying. And he is incredibly corrupt, and he is a womanizer, and he's incredibly violent. So as I was approaching the book, I had this kind of disconnect because I was like, wait, I remember this book being profoundly romantic, but I also remember it being steeped in corruption. And what I was impressed with actually in this reading is that this book is a real study in ambivalence. And I mean that kind of in the truest sense of the word, of like having two different sentiments that are competing with one another. I will stand by my argument that in fact Catalina is very much in love with Andrés, but I will also argue that there are things about him that are absolutely reprehensible, and she has a willed ignorance for a long time, and that willed ignorance is sort of chipped away at. But then, as certain elements of the plot thicken, she can no longer be so accepting of everything that her husband is doing. That's a good point to let you know we won't have any spoilers today. If you have not read this book, it's perfect for the summer. There is a romance and there is a lightness to it, but there also is some depth and some real gravitas. This is a book that is a real touchstone of Mexican feminist literature, certainly, and feminist literature as a whole. But there's also this incredible lightness that really does make it so appealing. Okay, for those of you who like an agenda, first we're going to do a very quick bio of Angeles Mastretta, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that she has said in interviews that I found really revealing. Then we're going to dive in by talking about the feminism that we see right from the start of this book. We're also going to look at how that feminism is connected really closely with the sexuality of Catalina Guzman. We're then going to talk about the treatment of history in the book. We're going to move on to talk about corruption and violence. I kept thinking during this whole entire reading of Carmen Soprano. Is that Tony Soprano? Yeah, Carmen Soprano. During that whole entire television series, which I loved, I found myself fascinated with the experience of being someone who is married to a person who is really wreaking a lot of havoc, someone who is really corrupt in many ways and in fact very violent. And I really loved the experience of being on the inside of Catalina's mind. If you're someone who has, wondered how Carmen Soprano is doing it, you should definitely read this book. And then at the end, we're going to talk about a few of the different literary aspects of the book that make it such a good piece of prose. This is prose that is very sophisticated. And for anyone who already loves it, or for anyone who is considering it, I want to point out some of the ways that it is very sophisticated, because the lightness of tone can sometimes allow a reader to think that it's a little more of a trifle than it is. Before we dive in to the bio of Angeles Mastretta, I wanted to just touch briefly on the fact that the version that I read this time is a later edition of the book. I have an edition of the book that came out in 1985, and I love it so much. It's interesting because one of the aspects that I like about it are the illustrations. As you can imagine, I am not someone who generally loves illustrations in novels. I don't love the idea of someone sort of shaping my vision of something. That is, in fact, one of the miracles of reading, is the fact that everyone, as they are reading, has the perfect vision in their own mind, and it is different from everyone else's. So generally, I don't find it helpful to have a vision imposed upon me. But I think I loved these because they were really stylized. They're black and white line drawings, and they're very kind of Art Deco in this way that is so appealing. So if you are on the YouTube, I'm going to put up an image of that cover, and I'm going to show you as we move through a few of the different illustrations that are found throughout the book. I like the cover of this other one for lots of different reasons, but I did not think it was a big improvement. Both this cover and also the illustrations are very literal. We have lots of like exact illustrations of things that are happening in the book, which I think generally is like a little cursi. It's like a little cheese ball, but Arráncame la vida really it pulled it off. Okay, we're going to dive in now to take a very quick look at the biography of Angeles Mastretta. So she was born in 1949 in Puebla. She was a journalist, an author, a producer, an actress, clearly someone who is very ambitious and very talented. She has won many different awards for her many different novels. I have not read anything else. I think I maybe read Mujeres de Ojos Grandes, but I don't really remember it, which actually doesn't mean I didn't read it, because as you know, if you're a longtime listener, I do not have a great memory. She grew up in a family of 5 children, and she said in an interview that what was most prized in her family was being able to tell a story well. So she was someone who, from a very young age, really valued the idea of stories. She wrote Arráncame la vida in 1985, and she's still alive. I was surprised. I listened to one of the interviews that I listened to came from a program called Aprendemos Juntos, and it actually was just from March of this past year. It was very interesting. There was a Q&A at the end of a very brief presentation that she gave, and I actually don't even remember the question, but I certainly remember her answer, which was she was talking about sexuality, which is a huge part of the story that she is telling with Catalina Guzman. But she was talking in this very kind of bold voice about how when she very first went to Mexico, to the capital from Puebla, with the intent of becoming a journalist, she realized that she was going to, if she wanted to be taken seriously, she was going to really have to act like a man. And what she said in the interview in this Q&A was that she realized that what men were doing is that they were going and everybody was, sleeping with everyone. There was lots of sex being had. There was sort of a new lover every week. And that if she wanted to be serious and wanted to be taken seriously, that she was going to have to do that. She made the distinction, though, that she was someone who also had deeply ingrained in her the idea that virginity was very important. So she had this tension between this idea of romance and love as being important, but that virginity was very important, but also this idea that you should be very sexually free. So she had this incredible statement about how she would, sleep with someone every week, but would always be falling in love with them, and that it was like a whole tragedia griega every single week, like a Greek tragedy every single week. Which, as you can imagine, I'm fairly certain that was a fairly kind of bold and somewhat exaggerated tale. But whenever I hear something like that is a little bit, perhaps something that has been said before, perhaps something that is a bit exaggerated, there obviously is a grain of truth. And in that case, it's such an interesting thing. Catalina in the book is so sexually progressive in many ways, in the sense that she really wants to feel pleasure, and she really is in pursuit of pleasure. At one point, she goes and learns from an older woman exactly how to bring herself pleasure. She then even brings some friends to the same woman so that she can be sure that everybody is in fact enjoying their bodies and their sexual lives. And again, this is a 15-year-old girl in Mexico in the 30s. So I was struck by this attitude towards sex, but also just by the boldness and by the sort of brashness of Angeles Mastretta in general. Okay, we're now going to dive into the book. I love the title, Arráncame la vida. I mean, first of all, I just love the way that it sounds, but it also has many different connotations here. So it is a song by someone named Agustin Lara, and this is not my area of specialty. I'm not someone who knows a ton about music from Mexico of that era, but there is tons of music in the book. But there was one interview that was very interesting that talked about the fact that the book is constructed like a bolero, which is a romantic song that has lots to do with betrayal and tragedy. But it's easy also to kind of overlook the fact that this is a very violent title. Arráncame la vida. In English, it is tear this heart out, which really does not trip off the tongue. But it really speaks to the passion that Catalina has, and it also speaks to the violence that her husband is constantly promoting. Quick note that there is also a movie, Arráncame la vida, Tear This Heart Out, that came out, I believe, in 2008 and was nominated for an Academy Award. Okay, we're now going to dive on into the book. So importantly, this is a book that has a first-person narrator. We are hearing from Catalina herself, and that sounds kind of basic, and it's something that I think readers might gloss right over, but it is really important. So this is a book that is really steeped in its moment in time. Mastretta does return again and again to this period following the Mexican Revolution, which was a time of incredible upheaval politically and societally. And what's really interesting here is that we are hearing from a 15-year-old girl. She's someone who has a lot of sass, for sure, and she is very strong in many ways, but she is someone who is sort of inside the patriarchy, and she is not pushing all that much against the patriarchy, to be clear. In many ways, she's very loyal to her husband. She's very loyal to her father. We're going to get to the part about the father, which is very interesting. But it's really important that we are beginning with this first-person narrator because it is Catalina's voice, and it is her perspective through which we are seeing this really very fulsome description of the revolution and its immediate aftermath. It's also important to look at where we are starting this narration. So on page 9, which is in my copy here, we have this. Ese año pasaron muchas cosas en este país. Entre otras, Andrés y yo nos casamos. So essentially, a lot of things happened this year in this country, and among those things, Andrés and I were married. So it is important that we are beginning with the marriage. We are beginning with the time when Andrés comes into her life, and in fact, totally changes her whole entire life, the entire trajectory of it. The book essentially ends with the end of their marriage. I'm not going to tell you anything about that. And it does feel very patriarchal, in fact, that we are talking essentially about a marriage. But I also think there's a sort of basic question, which is that anytime you have a first-person narration, you're going to ask the question, why this person and why now? And the answer to the question of why now is that it is her marriage that really allows her entrance into this world that she would not have seen otherwise, this world of postguerra, this world of after the revolution, where she really is entering into a very male and very corrupt world, and one that the reader is very eager actually to learn about. So right from the beginning, too, we also have this very straightforward tone, which is part of the lightness that we see throughout the novel, and it's part of the reason why this book feels so easy to read. So in the interest of following this story of what I'm arguing is ambivalence, I do want to make the point very clearly that throughout the book, Catalina is in fact very much in love with her husband. So right at the very beginning, he's 35, she's 15, and we are only, 3 paragraphs in, and at the bottom, she says this, Yo nunca había visto unos ojos tan vivos y no conocía a nadie con su expresión de certidumbre. So she's saying, I never saw anybody with such lively eyes or someone who was so self-assured. So right from the beginning, we have this very positive sense, not necessarily of who he is. She says he's not that attractive, and certainly her family has some reservations, and they're all a little bit suspicious, but there is something right from the beginning that really draws her to him. What's really fascinating to me is that literally 2 pages later, on page 11, so we're, 2 pages into the novel, and we are moving headlong into their sexual relationship. And it's really interesting to see how that sexual relationship is reflecting all sorts of feminism on the part of our young Catalina. This is also kind of an explanation of why it is that she's falling for this guy who she knows is maybe not, a super upstanding citizen. So at the bottom of page 11, she says, Tenía 15 años y muchas ganas de que me pasaran cosas. Por eso acepté cuando Andrés me propuso que fuera con él unos días en Tecolutla. Yo no conocía el mar. Él me contó que se ponía negro en las noches y transparente al mediodía. Quise ir a verlo. So he promises to show her the ocean, and she's very excited about it. She's also very upfront about the fact that she was 15 years old, but she really wanted things to happen to her. She is someone who's very adventuresome right from the start, who is someone who has a large appetite for doing things that are exciting and different and novel, and that are going to move her out of her, her tiny family, although she really does very much love her family. And then this is on page 12, so now we're like, 4 pages into the novel. And we have this first sexual experience between the two of them. And she sets it up again with this real lightness of tone. She says that, she had seen sex between bulls and horses. Pero el pito parado de un señor ya era otra cosa. But the erect penis of a man was certainly something else. So then she goes on to have this funny thing about how she's not sure if it's going to fit, and he sort of thinks this is charming and cute. And we have this kind of funny, light thing where she is very upfront about the fact that she doesn't think it's going to fit. And then, just, very quickly into the experience, we have this. Volvió a tocarme por todas partes como si se hubiera acabado la prisa. Me gustó. So right from the beginning, we have this idea that she is having sexual pleasure. And I have to say, there's an old adage about writing that I learned in my 3/4 of my MFA program that I did, which is that if you want to write a good sex scene, just say what is happening. And she is very good at that. There isn't a lot of hyperbole. There isn't a lot of metaphor. There isn't a lot of sentimental stuff happening here. She's really just telling us kind of mechanically what is happening in a very effective way. And in fact, that kind of matter-of-fact nature is in their dialogue as well. So he essentially asks whether or not she had an orgasm. She says no. She doesn't really understand what he's talking about. And so then on page 13, she's basically like, well, then show me how. Just teach me. And he says something like, it's actually not something you teach, it's something you learn, which is one of those terrible patriarchal, nonsense kind of things. But what is so interesting right from the start is we are having this sexual experience between the two of them that is light, that is speaking about female pleasure, and that's also speaking about her voice. So we have this first-person narrator who not only is going to tell us the whole story, but this is a first-person narrator, a protagonist, who really has a voice even within the scope of the novel. So she's really not afraid to say things to this, very decorated, important general who is much more commanding and who is 20 years older than she is, but who is someone who clearly she's very attracted to. And even a quick page later, before they leave this initial trip to the ocean, there's this excellent exchange where she actually gives him advice. She says that he'd been talking and talking and talking the whole time as if he were just talking to the walls. He essentially wasn't expecting to hear anything from her. And then she offers up this opinion. And he says, Vaya con la señorita, no sabe ni cómo se hacen los niños y ya quiere dirigir generales. Me está gustando. So he's saying she doesn't even know how to have sex, but she's trying to manage a general or direct a general, which is so excellent because he is appreciating that. So the important thing here is we are 4 pages in and we have covered so much material. We really know a lot about the interaction between the two of them, kind of the vibe between the two of them. There's a lot of strength on both sides, but they really have this kind of mutual appreciation, and both are very much kind of charmed one by the other. And one of the things that I liked most is that this idea of the voice as being linked to sexuality is something that we see again and again and again. She's not someone who is ever soft-spoken, and she is someone who pursues sexual pleasure throughout the entire book. And I think it's important to recognize it for the deeply feminist thing that it is, because we have this very young girl who is standing up to literally one of the most blatant embodiments of the patriarchy. One quick note on the patriarchy. I don't think I needed more information about why it was that Catalina was attracted to Andrés Asensio. But this time reading through, I did find this whole kind of vein that also helped me understand why she was attracted to him. And this is the idea that Catalina is very close with her dad. She's very much a daddy's girl. And I have to say, my sister and I talk about this all the time. We are not daddy's girls. Our dad never was protective of us, always assumed that we would make good decisions, treated us like very independent, strong people. My dad's also not a romantic dude. So I was having a little bit of a hard time really digging into all of the kind of romantic overtones of young Catalina with her dad. They're very affectionate with each other, which, I mean, there's obviously nothing wrong with this, but I just was a little like, this is really standing out to me. At the bottom of page 76, we have this. This is Catalina speaking, obviously. She is our first person narrator. Me daba muchos besos, metía su mano bajo mi blusa y me pintaba con los dedos rayitas en la espalda hasta que me iba amansando y empezaba a reírme. So, he's giving her lots of kisses. He's putting his hand up under her blouse. Turns out that he's tickling her back. But when I first read that he was putting his hand up her blouse, I was like, oh my gosh, what's happening here? And then the father says, así ya estás preciosa. ¿Quieres ser mi novia? Like, do you want to, you look beautiful like that. Do you want to be my girlfriend? Claro, le decía yo, tu novia, pero no tu esposa. So yeah, I want to be like your mistress or your girlfriend, but not your wife. So I was a little taken aback by that. Obviously, this is playful. And she does have a very sweet relationship with her father, and he is a source of support. You also get a sense right from the beginning that, she comes from a family that was not well off, and her father, there are lots of kids in the family. Her father is both, I think, a little reticent to let Catalina go and be with Andres Asensio, but also fully understands that this is an opportunity, an economic opportunity for the family that they really should not pass up. I am realizing that some people might just be like, that is crazy. A 15-year-old should not ever be with a 35-year-old, or that I don't think anyone has the illusion that a 15-year-old couldn't be in love with a 35-year-old. And there are definitely some problematic aspects to the whole thing. But in many ways, they don't enter into the book. And it doesn't feel as predatory as it probably should, partially because we get the sense that Andres has respect and is very charmed by her, but also that she has a lot of strength and independence, and that she is making a decision that really is coming from a place of romantic attraction. So it's important to note that we are beginning the relationship from a place of real kind of mutual attraction, mutual charm. And one of the things that I really appreciated about the book this time is that it does give us a decades-long vision of a marriage, and not just any marriage, but a marriage that is under a lot of stress because of the governmental ambition of Andres Asensio, also because he is a criminal and causes all sorts of violence. He's also a total womanizer in general, just a very bad dude. But I found it so interesting when we did have these moments of real longing on the part of Catalina. And I think Mastretta does this kind of masterful job of really expressing the fact that it's very difficult. Catalina really does have a lot of love for this man, but also understands that he is a very complicated and really not great person. And part of what is interesting is her ambivalence about him also stems from the fact that he is someone who is very much out in the world. He has a lot of agency. Obviously, he's an important political figure. He is based on an actual figure named Camacho. I don't actually know that much about that. He was, I think, more involved in Puebla than in the capital, although I'm not totally sure about that. But she's really chafing under sort of the domestic demands that are being made on her. And also she's kind of bored and lonely. But the way that manifests itself often is a kind of longing for him. So she talks on page 143 about fear that she would have when she would wake up without him by her side, and about how if he was gone for periods of time, she missed him. So you have a very explicit sense of what that ambivalence feels like. On page 163, she says, Siempre creí que lo único necesario para vivir tranquila era tener a Andrés todos los días conmigo. So there is so she's saying that that she always felt like the only thing she needed to feel safe was to have him by her side. You can read this obviously in the sense that she would be concerned about violence and reprisals on the part of his enemies, but it is much deeper than that. I don't think she feels particularly unsafe in terms of her physical safety. You do not get that sense through the book, at least not most of the time. But you do get the sense that she that they really do, even when times are tough for the two of them, they have different ways, whether it's sexual relations or whether it's riding horses. They do a lot of horseback riding. There are ways that they still really enjoy each other's company. So I just want to touch briefly on the way that some of this violence is treated in the book. Almost all of it is happening sort of off in the wings. These are not things that we are seeing directly very often. And that is part of the reason why the reader, sort of forgives Catalina for this kind of willed ignorance that she has. There are a couple of different times when people confront her by saying, literally, your husband killed my husband. And it's really telling because often her reaction is like, he would never have done that himself. There's a lot of sense of like, maybe he had someone kill your husband, which really speaks to the level of corruption and violence in Mexico in this period. I listened to a fascinating interview. Two women, it's a podcast called En la Misma Página. Really interesting conversation between two Mexican women about what they kept calling loopholes, that there was a certain acceptance of a level of crime, certainly in the time immediately after the revolution, but still that there is a certain amount of violence and corruption and killing that is simply accepted. This is something that I don't have a lot of information about, but it certainly is something that is depicted well in the book. And one of the things that happens is as the novel moves along, this kind of willed ignorance that she has is eroded by the fact that there is too much evidence. Evidence is beginning to pile up. And one of the things that I liked best is that when she really can't bury her head in the sand anymore, what she tries to do is in fact make things right for the families of these victims. So whether that is employing them or providing them with a means for making a living on their own, we have this sense of her as becoming a little bit more aware of what is actually happening and taking some sort of responsibility. And there was one aspect that I want to touch on. I'm going to try to do this without spoiling anything. I was fascinated by the idea that Andres is very accepting of the notion, the idea of her having a lover, that he really doesn't have a lot of opposition to that. He himself is someone who has many, many lovers. He has many different children with many different women. He has many different women. He's supplied them with different houses. It's a very open secret that he has all of these different women in these different places. What I found interesting is that there are a lot of actually very light and somewhat humorous interactions between Catalina and Andres that have to do with this idea of her having a lover. The problem arises when she is involved with someone whose politics don't match his politics. So for me personally, one of the interesting things that kept happening is I would have these ideas about what was acceptable, what is not, whether that is marital infidelity or whether that is having someone shot. You really are getting to know people whose perspectives on those are very different, and you're getting to like those characters and you're getting to understand their relationship. You certainly are not coming away thinking that it's a good idea to have people killed, but this idea of ambivalence, this idea of having to sort of hold different things, opposing ideas at the same time, is something that we see in many different aspects throughout the work. Okay, I want to close today not by looking at the end because I don't want to spoil anything, but by talking about some of the literary merit of the book. So a couple of different things that work so well. One is this tone. So often this lightness of tone is most effective in these really kind of tense and sort of dark moments because it acts as a kind of comic relief. So we have throughout, you could even hear it in the initial interaction between Catalina and Andres, that there's this kind of charming kind of teasing thing going on a lot of the time. But we maintain that even when the text gets much darker. And it's important to point out that this lightness of tone is somewhat pervasive, but there's also a lot of depth. There are a lot of very difficult things that are happening. A lot of violent and kind of terrible things are happening in the book. For example, at one point, Catalina is with one of her friends and essentially says, because she's starting to feel unsafe, and essentially they're at like a spa together, which they're always in these kind of very female or very domestic settings. In this case, they're at a spa, and Catalina very, vulnerably says to her friend, "I don't want to die." And the friend says something like, "Yeah, certainly not now that you're looking so good." That is a terrible translation. But we have that kind of moment when, not always, because often Mastretta does a very good job of letting the sort of darkness be, but there are many times when things are getting very dark and we do have that kind of levity. And it's always very smart like that and somewhat unexpected. And I think it's notable that this tone is very difficult to pull off. This kind of lightness together with this kind of gravitas is really well done. Another one of these literary tropes that she uses throughout the novel in really excellent ways is the idea of foreshadowing. So there is a lot in this novel where characters are saying stuff in very clear terms in a way that should feel heavy-handed. And oftentimes it's in this kind of lighter tone that they'll say things like literally when Catalina says, "I don't want to die." There are a couple of characters who do die, I'm not going to tell you which. But throughout, we have them at different points talking about their death, or we have the narrator describing different things that have to do with graves or tombs. And it should feel heavy-handed, but it doesn't. The thing that it does very nicely, in fact, is kind of build up this tension. You have this sense that these people are in a very, certain of them, are in a very dangerous, very precarious situation. And a lot of it comes from this excellent use of foreshadowing. Another thing that she does so well is foils. So a foil in literature, when they're well done, they can be so illustrative. So is that how you say that? Illustrative? They can illustrate a lot. So a foil is basically someone who has a lot of the same characteristics as our protagonist, but who has a very different sort of outcome or a very different manner of being in the world. So in the case of Catalina, you could have any one of her friends, any one of the wives of these different government officials, and there are lots of them, and they're very, very different than she is. One of the things this does is allow us to see how different Catalina is from a lot of them, which is very helpful in terms of our appreciation of her and also in terms of our sense of intimacy, this idea that we really know the world well because we have a good sense of who she is. But whenever we have these kind of real disparities between her attitude about her husband and another woman's, or her attitude about her children and another woman's, it's really very telling. Another element that is so well done is this idea that when you are reading a book, if you come across a house or if you come across a garden, you should take a step back and see whether or not that is being used symbolically. So if a writer is worth her salt, she will take something like a house or a garden, and the state of that house or the state of that garden will say a lot about the group of people who are living there. So in the course of the novel, Catalina has many different homes with Andres, and the way that those spaces change says so much about where she is in her relationship and how she's feeling about things. Often, they are a real mix of public and private. These are places where she's having to entertain. There's one house that has like 15 bedrooms, and all of these are places where she should feel very settled and yet doesn't. Especially later in the novel, houses become more and more important. At one point, she has a small house that is her own space, and it really speaks to this idea of her as having some independence and a sense of her own self apart from her husband. Also, at the very end of the novel, there's a whole thing that happens with lots of different houses that also speaks to the primacy of Catalina in terms of her relationship with Andres. It's really interesting, too, to think about maternity in the novel. She has her own 2 children that she has with Andres, and it's very interesting because she is someone who really makes personal pleasure a priority, but she really does not like being pregnant. I don't know why I put those two in juxtaposition like that, but she is not happy being pregnant. And that part of the novel and her sort of attitude about children is really fascinating. Yet again, we have Catalina really doing her own thing. She does have very close relationships with her children. She also ends up having close relationships with many of the other children that Andres has had with other women, which really speaks to her expansiveness and sort of her generosity. But I really liked the idea that there was sort of an unexpected attitude toward maternity that gave the whole thing a little more texture. There was also one point in the novel, which I found really telling, where she really felt like she needed to separate Andres from her children, which made a huge amount of sense to me. There are a number of different points, of course, where she is acknowledging the fact that he is a dangerous person and that what is happening around them is very wrong. So this is actually a perfect place to end. I loved the depiction of one of her adopted daughters. She's not like officially adopted, but one of Andres's daughters with another woman. Catalina ends up having a very close relationship with this young woman. And in many ways, this kind of stepdaughter feels very much like a foil because in many ways she's very similar to Catalina and in some ways she's very different. And obviously, when you have a new generation at the end of a novel, we are really speaking about the future. We're speaking about the ways that what has happened in the novel within the family is going to manifest itself moving forward. And I loved the way that Mastretta depicted this young woman because we see a lot of the same strengths that we see in Catalina, and we see some of the complexity, certainly. But in many ways, it ended up feeling like a very optimistic book, because we see some of the very best characteristics of Catalina that are sort of amplified in this young woman. In some ways, I feel like today we've only scratched the surface of this book that I really, really love. But I hope that today has given you a slightly deeper appreciation of all the ways that Angeles Mastretta has written this book that is both profound and eye-opening and disturbing, and yet also incredibly light and inspiring in lots of ways. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.